You know, it's so interesting. I'm so used to talking to students who live in terror of the grades that I'm going to give them, that when I say good morning, I'm used to students going, shh. But we're talking with serious grown-up people from a wide variety of groups, and it's a genuine pleasure and it's a privilege to welcome you all and thank you for coming to this event on the future of U.S. agricultural and rural development policy. Where do the 2020 presidential candidates stand? We're on the cusp of the Iowa caucuses, a state where, quote, corn is king, exploring today where the leading candidates for the Republican, of course there's only one Republican, I guess, and Democratic candidates for president stand, at least as of today and as best we can tell, on agricultural policy. Today's event is particularly timely. This is the one time, perhaps, in the presidential election process where all of the candidates have been paying at least some attention to agricultural policy. Agriculture is complex, and so too, therefore, is agricultural policy. As a result, today's panel cannot cover absolutely every aspect of U.S. agricultural policy. But our panelists will certainly enrich our understanding of key issues and where the candidates, including the president, stand on those issues. In the AEI report released this morning, copies of which are in front of you, that was written by Dr. Glauber and myself, the authors identified the candidates' positions in 10 different areas of agricultural policy. These are the 10 areas: farm safety net programs, that would be crop insurance and price-driven and income-driven subsidies, conservation programs designed at maintaining the quality of land, climate change, which is linked closely to conservation programs for many of the candidates, agricultural trade, renewable fuels. That's not a USDA program, it's a program managed by EPA, but it's of significant importance in agriculture. Agricultural R&D, agricultural labor markets and immigration, sustainable food and labeling, competition policy, and rural development policy. So the report covers all of those 10 areas. We're going to focus mainly in the panelists' opening remarks on the first 6 of those topics, but we'll take questions during the Q&A time, and we hope to have quite a lot of Q&A time on any of those areas, to the extent that the panelists feel comfortable in responding to questions. At the outset, just to provide a little bit of context for the discussion, we thought it would be useful to show you the approximately $33 billion that the CBO estimated would be spent in 2019 as of May of last year. These numbers are a little bit out of date because at about 4 o'clock last night, the Congressional Budget Office issued new numbers. So I'm going to apologize that a couple of these numbers don't reflect their latest forecasts. But if you look at the pie chart, one of the stunning things about this pie chart is that, in fact, the biggest share of payments that are going to agricultural producers come through Donald Trump's gift of market facilitation payments to compensate farmers for, quote, losses associated with his trade wars with China and other countries. That accounts for almost 30% of total direct subsidies to farmers. Crop insurance is a substantial deal, accounting for about 25% of those subsidies. That's a little misleading because about 30% of those monies are actually subsidies that go to crop insurance companies one way or another. So we're funding both the crop insurance industry and farmers through the subsidies to crop insurance program. 21% goes to price and income supports. About 17% goes to conservation program. That's about $5 billion a year right now. And we actually, ironically, spend very little more on agricultural research and development programs, which is one area where everyone seems to be benefiting through increased productivity at the farm gate level. We give public R&D resources about the same as we give to crop insurance agents and crop insurance companies at about $2.9 billion a year. So I just wanted to outline for you roughly where public monies are going. That's not the only mechanism of support for the farm sector. Notice there's no little slice for rural development. That's because actual annual outlays from the federal government, taxpayer and borrowing monies, account for a very small share of total spending on agriculture-related programs. I now want to turn and just introduce the panel, and then I'm really thrilled to have such a distinguished panel here today, by the way. The person who's going to speak first, and I'm going to introduce all of them right now so that we just move smoothly through the discussion. The first is Dr. Barry Goodwin. He's the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department at North Carolina State University. He is a fellow of what I call still the American Association of Agricultural Economists, because I can't remember the renamed version of that. He's a very distinguished scholar, and he's going to discuss candidates' perspectives and the nature of farm safety net and conservation programs. Dr. Joseph Glauber, who I suspect many of you are very familiar with, is currently a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, having previously served as the chief economist at the United States Department of Agriculture. He is also a fellow of the AAEA, and he will focus on three areas: climate change, renewable fuels, and agricultural trade policy. Dr. Philip Pardee is also a fellow of the AAEA. He is a professor of economics and director, and I never get this right, but I'll try and get it right, Phil. He's director of the International Science, Technology, Practice, and Policy Center at the University of Minnesota. And he is arguably the leading researcher in the world on agricultural R&D and related issues. He wouldn't say that, but I can say that. He will naturally enough discuss agricultural R&D policy and where the US fits and where the candidates fit in the national and global setting. And finally, it's a real pleasure to introduce Jerry Hagstrom, Mr. Jerry Hagstrom, who is the executive editor of the Hagstrom Report, one of the most widely read daily reports on agricultural issues and food issues. He is also a distinguished columnist at the National Journal. And Jerry will provide some critically important insights about the political landscapes the candidates are facing at this point in rural states like Iowa, where they stand, and why they stand where they stand in the context of rural voters. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome all of the panelists. And now what I'd like to do is simply turn things over to Dr. Goodwin, and then we'll follow with Dr. Glauber, Dr. Pardee, and Mr. Hagstrom.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Let's see here. So I'm just going to give an outline here briefly in what sort of the current state of affairs is with safety nets. And I think most ag programs sort of can be considered to be some form of a safety net, some more than others. First, the Farm Bill policies. I think a cornerstone of U.S. ag policy for the last several years, since 2012 especially, has been subsidized crop insurance. It protects yields and it protects prices through revenue insurance. And I think that's notable when we talk about some of the other mechanisms that are triggered by low prices, MFP in particular. It's notable to know that there are programs, part of the Farm Bill, in place to address this. I looked at, through the cause-loss data from RMA, how much of the indemnities, there's been a lot of concern about low prices with the trade dispute. In 2018, about 4%, 3.9% of the indemnities were based upon price declines, and then only 1% last year. So there is protection there for price declines built into that program. In 2019, the most recent year we really have any good information, 380 million acres were insured and 110 billion in liability, so it's a very big program. It's heavily subsidized. It's not insurance, as I'm sure all of you know, as we usually think of insurance, because the 65% premium subsidy really translates into a large net positive gain for anyone buying the insurance. This last year, 6.3 billion was paid out in premium subsidies. And I don't have the specifics on A&O, but there's a substantial amount that goes to the private insurance companies that administer this program. So it's important to keep in mind there's a couple of different constituency groups for this. There's the farmers themselves, but also the insurance companies, which don't bear a lot of risk in this program and typically enjoy underwriting gains. This past year, as you know, preventive planning has been a major issue. And preventive planning in the past has been really a big question of whether there was ever an intent to plant on that land. This year, I think it's about 20 billion acres. Or a million acres. They finally figured out that was prevented from planting in a timely fashion. So that's been a big issue, and it actually feeds into the MFP payments to some extent. The Title I programs, what we call the commodity title, the basic programs that have been around in some form or another for many years. Marketing loans, really not very relevant these days. Loan rates have been increased, but they're still far below market prices for all the crops. So those have not been triggered. The ARC and PLC programs are two programs that are paid on the basis of historical production base acreage. ARC in the past, for most commodities before the last Farm Bill, ARC had the bulk of enrollment, with the exception of peanuts and rice and a few others that went with PLC. We did see some shift toward the agricultural risk coverage, ARC, this last time, but I think it was less than a lot of us expected to see. 183 million base acres enrolled there, and PLC 68 million base acres, and I'll give you a crop breakout of that. It's notable, I think, of the major crops, only rice, cotton, peanuts, wheat, and grain sorghum actually triggered PLC payments. The big development and really in an ad hoc form of support, not part of the Farm Bill, is the market facilitation payments. Really a huge wrench thrown into the operation here. It's interesting, I'll say more about it here in a little bit, but it's very interesting that this really represents, in my view at least, has some characteristics of being support that is coupled back to production again. In 2019, it was based upon planted acreage. 2018, based upon production. The total numbers differ, I think, around 25 billion, we said, Vince, in total. So I'll say a little more about that in a minute. This is the ARC PLC base acreage enrollment of coming out of the last Farm Bill. And you can see it's split back and forth, but for most of the major crops, corn, soybeans, producers chose to stay with the ARC, and all of that is at the county level. They have had the opportunity through the past few Farm Bills to update their yields. Some rather complicated options that are there, but that does have important trade implications, again, because it represents tying what used to be based upon a base established many years ago in the 80s or 2002. It is tying that support back to more recent production when you allow updating. The MFP payment rates, as I said, this is the administration's attempt to garner political support or compensate for some of the perceived losses in prices due to the ongoing trade disputes. You see in 2019, the payment rates were increased significantly and expanded to other crops. So I think it's relevant to see how much the increases have been there. In every case where we had 2018 payments, the rates of payment were increased in 2019. So I think of all of the things that I think are a big issue right now to look at, this is really what I think is a major one. And how it's going to play into the election, I think, is a very interesting question. But you can see a shift here away from, we had direct payments, we had a period of high prices when these safety net programs were not paying, at least through the Title I programs. But you see again the market facilitation payments that have really spiked here in the last couple of years. And again, to the extent that that's based upon current acreage or current production, it does represent, at least in some ways, a return to support being based upon actual production and therefore relevant to WTO obligations of the U.S. And I think there's been some concern, Joe's the expert on this, certainly, but some concern that we're heading toward or already there, in fact, of exceeding the U.S., I think it's $19.8 billion limit on domestic support with these payments. Of course, this is an instrument of the administration. And you can see there's been a bit of a geographic shift toward the South and the Corn Belt as well in where these payments are going. So I think that's relevant, and it largely reflects the fact that at least the shift to the South, that we've opened this up to other commodities. So I'll say a little bit, well, just to summarize the safety net programs, I think looking at the various platforms of the candidates, everybody's in favor of safety net programs for farmers. I don't think you'll find anything that represents a departure from that. There's subtle differences in how they would approach this. I think largely, though, it really reflects the continuation of existing programs with perhaps some increases. There's a focus in the flavor of the debate on targeting support towards small family farms. And that's a bit of a misnomer, as you know. Most all farms, large farms, are family farms for the large part. And any support that's based upon acreage or production is going to necessarily be focused toward larger scale operations. There's a lot of discussion about Sanders in particular, a so-called living wage for farmers. The one thing that's often not discussed within the context of farm incomes is whether we're talking about the income of the household as a whole, which really reflects the economic welfare of that family unit or household, versus farming income. And farm incomes are down without a doubt, but most farm households, even very, very big commercial farms, still rely on off-farm income to a large extent. So I think it's not totally clear when we're talking about safety nets. Typically, they don't consider the overall farm household. Sanders, I think, has the most radical proposals, which is, I guess, not a surprise. But in addition to this farm living wage, there's an advocacy of parity pricing, which we haven't heard about in many, many years. I'm assuming with parity pricing, they're still talking about going back to the 1908 to 11 or something like that.
If you apply parity pricing, the price that would be guaranteed for corn would be about $20 a bushel, as opposed to the $3.80 that it's currently in.
It just ignores any changes that have happened over the last 100 years in terms of cost of production and so forth. I think there is some. Joe and Vince referred to Sanders as a back to the future plan, and it sounds a bit like that, but supply controls may also be a part of that what What's notable about Warren's platform, I think, is that there's a notion of basing support on cost of production. And really, every time we've heard of support tied to cost of production in the past, it's very difficult exercise to define cost of production. We had a lot of efforts to get cost of production insurance back many years ago and never were able to really settle on that. It's difficult to measure cost of production. So there's many issues with that. I think that's really the main distinctions there in terms of safety net programs. I think Sanders has some discussion of, instead of Title I programs, having a permanent standing disaster relief program, which may have some merits. So in terms of just briefly the conservation programs, conservation in the last Farm Bill really is pretty much budget neutral. It was front-end loaded a little bit, the allocation across the years, but it's 7% of projected spending on the Farm Bill, but that's including nutrition programs. So it's a more significant. Vince had a graphic on that just a little bit ago. I think there's some modest changes to sort of target some specific objectives. Really continuing the existing programs, which really there are three that are prominent. The Conservation Reserve Program, introduced in '85, has been around since then. It's been reauthorized and expanding the acreage cap to 27 million, I think from about 23 million, so not a trivial increase. EQIP and CSP are programs that are intended to address conservation issues on working operations. EQIP in the past was skewed slightly in favor of livestock conservation issues, water quality, air quality, and so forth. And that's been reduced, I think it was 60% before, down to 50%, and there's an increase in wildlife practices to 10%. CSP is reauthorized, but the slight reduction in enrollment and funding was cut by $1.24 billion a year over the 10 years that it's scored at. And then there are some conservation easement programs, still very trivial programs in large part. In terms of the candidates, I think the things that you hear so much about without a lot of specificity is a Green New Deal, control of greenhouse gases, and carbon sequestration. Really, they all share common themes, but I think in terms of specifics, it involves some expansions and enhancements to what we have now. So I'll turn it over to Joe here.
I didn't bring any slides. I'm just going to talk, largely because I have a lot to talk about. I'm going to try to hit three areas here. And these are broader areas that aren't necessarily specific to agriculture, but are of keen interest to agricultural producers and others, and that's trade, climate, and the renewable fuel standard. So let me start with trade, and I think there you have President Trump, sort of the self-styled tariff man whose tenure, at least thus far, has been defined by this aggressive unilateralism. I think within the first day or two of becoming president, one of his first actions was to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He announced that he was going to renegotiate the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, announced that he was going to renegotiate the NAFTA. NAFTA, one of the worst deals ever negotiated in the U.S., according to the president, or the then candidate Trump, I guess. And then from there, we went to imposing 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum from China, Mexico, Canada, EU, and a handful of other countries. Threatened automobile tariffs on the EU, imposed Section 301 tariffs on China. And all of this, of course, built up to what was a fairly major trade war with China, and has I think, by most evidence, hurt agricultural exports quite a good deal. China was one of our largest markets, and those exports were cut significantly. Prices dropped in 2018, and that, as more and more producers and others started making their voices heard, resulted in a fairly large bailout that Barry mentioned. This market facilitation payment program that's paying out somewhere in the order of total, not just market facilitation payments, but some other aids as well, around $28 billion over for both 2018 and 2019, and with some prospects, people talking about potential another round. That is another whole new program for 2020 losses, but we'll see. And then lastly is the president's play in international fora like the WTO, where he's blocked appointments to the appellate body and has put that in crisis as well. So you turn to the Democrats and you say, well, how different are they? Are we seeing dramatically different differences there? And at the one end, there is Mike Bloomberg, who is at least hasn't said a lot, but is professed belief in free trade and open markets. Yet on the other hand, there's candidates like Senator Sanders and Warren who, at least in reading a lot of their campaign material and other things, look far more protectionist and see trade more as undermining manufacturing and other blue-collar jobs. And I think even Barry mentioned the setting price supports, their policies of setting price supports high, and Warren has a proposal for a grain reserve. I mean, these are policies that are much more insular than outward-looking. So I think the intent of the policies are probably far more closely aligned to the president's in one sense, if not in direct action. As far as voting records are concerned, and again, this only concerns those who've been members of Congress. Most have voted against trade agreements, with the exception of the recent vote over the USMCA, the new negotiated NAFTA. Both Klobuchar and Biden opposed CAFTA. Klobuchar voted against the Peru Free Trade Agreement. I think that Joe Biden did not vote for that. This was prior to him being vice president, but he didn't vote in that particular for that particular piece of legislation. And for the new USMCA, Sanders opposed, but Klobuchar and Warren did vote for it. It was also supported by Biden and Buttigieg. Most opposed TPP, though, and there, of course, when Vice President Biden, his administration actually put forward TPP, he now has indicated support for joining CPTPP, that is the new TPP without the U.S. that's been ratified by the other member countries. They would consider joining if modified to include new standards for labor and the environment. I might add that Warren and Sanders have indicated no support for that. Now, all have criticized the president for the impact of tariffs on farmers, but again, it's unclear as to what their strategy would be vis-a-vis China, and it's hard to beat the tariff man there. I mean, in terms of acting, at least appearing tough. So I think that one way or the other, assuming a Democrat wins in 2020, that relationship of dealing with China is going to be a very, very interesting one. I would say this, however, is that presumably the Democrats are more likely to work within the system of international trade rules. I think clearly Trump has been a unilateralist there, has also been very, very critical of the WTO. And I think that we're likely to see a return to more normal relations with our multilateral obligations there. However, I think that most of these candidates, certainly Klobuchar, certainly Sanders and Warren, have talked about the importance of trade remedy laws like Section 232 and Section 301. Okay, so let's turn to climate, where I think there is a much bigger difference between the Republican, that is the president, and the Democrats. No surprise, President Trump's been much like trade. The thing that stands out is sort of this aggressive unilateralist approach, pulled out of the Paris Agreement, reversed many of the Obama-era regulations dealing with fuel efficiency and automobile emission standards, dismantled the Clean Power Plan, and then this general promotion of coal and gas and oil development. And the Democrats present a very different view. I think almost, I would say all of them have embraced to one degree or another the so-called Green New Deal, which at least has the goal of achieving zero net carbon emissions by 2050. Most of them have policies then to promote clean energy. That is a move towards electricity away from other fossil fuels, promote R&D and investments in green technologies, and as Barry mentioned, embrace agricultural practices that either reduce carbon or sequester carbon. The big issue, of course, is how do you pay for this? Because these are trillion-dollar investments over time. Many have talked, like Sanders and Warren and Biden, about ending subsidies for fossil fuels. Well, that's good. Roll back. Some would say, well, roll back the tax cuts that we saw in the first year or so of the Trump administration. But less direct endorsement of carbon taxes or cap and trade. And I think most people view the sort of monies necessary to get to a net zero emissions in 2050 are going to require some tax on carbon or some implicit cap on emissions. And there, again, I think everyone realizes that as soon as the word tax is out of your mouth, there's going to be a lot of incoming criticism. And so, you get candidate things where Joe Biden, for example, says he supports the idea of polluter pays, but really doesn't provide much details. Now, when I say that, we're talking about campaign material. As we go through debates and other things, you do see more and more emerge from the candidates in this regard. So we're talking at a given point in time. But, Klobuchar supports capping emissions, but would avoid adverse impacts on agriculture. Well, so presumably that means not capping emissions for agriculture, but agriculture is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Sanders, in 2016, was supportive of a carbon tax. I think he's been a little more coy in 2020 there. And Warren also, when asked directly about a carbon tax in interviews, has said, yes, that would be something that would have to be considered. Mike Bloomberg, yes, but no details. Buttigieg, yes, but there he would take the revenues and put it back to needy Americans. So again, climate's a big issue, and it's if you think you're going to go the route of trying to achieve the sorts of goals of the new Green Deal, that's a lot of money. And so I don't think we've quite seen the sort of plans that one would like to see in terms of how, and the impacts of how those things would actually affect agriculture and everyone else for that matter. And then lastly, I'll talk about the renewable fuel standard. Again, this is something that's unique, probably because of Iowa coming right out of as being the first caucus or primary that renewable fuel standard comes up and has such a prominent role. Vince mentioned the West Wing episode where ethanol was mentioned, but so one has to end up taking a side on ethanol, and at least through the primary. After that, it tends to diminish insofar as the national debate is concerned. And the president has shown some vulnerability on this issue. I mean, after all, he is, as Barry mentioned, EPA with consultations with Energy and USDA are in charge of implementing the renewable fuel standard. It's on the plus side, the president approved year-round availability of E15. That is blending up to 15% of the volume in your gasoline with ethanol. But really, that's not a switch you just turn on. You need infrastructure, and that's been one of the drawbacks all the way through this, is that most gasoline stations where you gas up don't have the infrastructure to offer a blend up to 15%. You normally get 10%. So The question is, how much will this really affect things without changes in the mandates themselves? And the other big criticism has been the fact that this so-called issue of small refiner exemptions, where small refineries who are obligated to blend ethanol, there's provisions in the Act, the Energy Act, which would allow them to come in and say, look, this is too onerous for us. A small operation is too costly. EPA can then grant these exemptions. The issue has been, well, what happens to those volumes? Do they get reallocated among the other companies? And that's what certainly the corn industry and others have wanted. The president has tried on a couple of times over the last few months to try to rectify that and to reallocate, but still is receiving a lot of criticism from both the ethanol industry, corn growers, and even members of Congress, Republican members of Congress like Senator Grassley. With that, you turn to the Democrats, and there's no Ted Cruz or John McCain, of course, both Republicans, but there's no Democrat out there like McCain and Cruz were in previous years saying no to ethanol, or just saying what a bad idea it is. Even Mike Bloomberg, who over time or previously was very critical of ethanol, has now said, well, he could see it as a transitional fuel as you're moving towards zero net emissions in 2050. But I think that is and so most of the platform on ethanol for most of the Democrats have been to criticize the president on the exemptions for small refineries. But at the end of the day, the real issue with ethanol is exactly this point made by Bloomberg. That is, if you're all and all of them are in the camp of the Green New Deal and pushing for, moving fuels from fossil fuels to electricity, that leaves very little room for ethanol. And so over the long run, all these ones are saying they're in favor of the Green New Deal, but also in favor of ethanol. And I think that at best, that's a transition if indeed you're going to end up in a fuel-free, fossil fuel-free environment. And with that, I'll close and get back to questions later.
So we're now going to turn to Dr. Pardee, who's going to talk about R&D issues in agriculture, which actually lie at the core of our long-run ability to produce food.
Thanks, Vince. Clearly, the politics around the role of R&D in the Farm Bill and the USDA is different than it was back in the middle 1800s when Abraham Lincoln signed the very brief Articles of Incorporation for the USDA, which, if you go back and look at that, run barely a couple of pages, printed pages. But the standout in those Articles of Incorporation were that the clear operational focus of the USDA was as a vehicle to discover and diffuse modern technologies and modes of farm practice for the benefit of the agricultural community and the broader economy. And in the early days, in the early decades, well over half of the USDA's budget was directed firmly to R&D and also related extension activities. So it's the initial incorporation of that institution was around a vehicle of innovation in US agriculture. If we fast forward to now, as Vince's pie diagram showed, that the picture is very different. As a share of just the farm-related spending within the USDA, R&D is less than 10%, around 9%. As a share of the overall spend, including the nutrition programs, it's less than 2%. So we've gone from well over half down to about 1.9% of the institution's budget focused around R&D and technical change issues. The landscape facing US agricultural R&D now is very different even over the last half century or so, and I put some data up here that we've been tracking this for some time, and you can see a structural shift. These are in real deflated terms, and they're reported not by the funder but by the performer. So when I say private, I mean privately performed food and ag R&D, and public here is publicly performed food ag R&D. And you can see a couple of things here. First off, that beginning back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the private role as a vehicle of technical change in agriculture started to surpass, at least by spending, the public role, and has continued to grow substantially and now far exceeds public spending. So the food and ag component of life science research is like the rest of life science research. It's like the health sector now. I think a lot of people in the policy arena think that there's still a dominance of public presence in the innovation space in US agricultural R&D, and that's not the case. But there's also been clearly starting in the late 1990s a slowing down and then a scaling back, in fact a policy downgrading of a commitment to R&D undertaken by the USDA and the agricultural experiment stations throughout the state. So a big structural shift in that spending that's taken place over time. If we lift our horizons beyond the US border and look at where R&D in the US sits vis-a-vis the rest of the world, recognising there's just reams of economic evidence to show the very strong relationships between R&D spending and improved productivity performance of US agriculture, which is at the root of the comparative advantage that US agriculture has in international trade and export markets. There's a seismic shift, and in the last decade and a half, almost a tsunami in terms of the US's role vis-a-vis the rest of the world in this space. So if you look back 60 years or so ago, the US alone in the global public ag R&D arena constituted about 15% of the global total, which was just a little less than $9 billion. We've had a five-fold increase in public investments in food ag R&D, and the US share has shrunk to 9.1%. So we're below a tenth. We were at nearly 15% of the total. The clear major shift there is China started liberating its agricultural sectors in the late 70s. Was actually significant anti-scientific sorts of policies in place back in the 50s and 60s, which had actually gutted their research systems, not just in agriculture, but nationally. But they started to turn that around in the mid-1980s. Some major policy initiatives that were taken to pivot towards investments in R&D in China. So they seriously doubled down, and whereas the US slowed down and scaled back, they doubled down and stuck with it, and have been doing that for multiple decades, such that they are now, their global share is where the US was back in 1961, so they're exceeding the global spend. And in fact, if you look subtly in this figure, that the rich countries in total, the high-income countries, used to have greater than half the global spend. They now have less than half the global spend. So the economic geography of the roots of innovation in food and agriculture have undergone a fundamental change over the last couple of decades, in significant part to policy decisions taken here and in China and elsewhere in the world. If you look at large agricultural economies like Brazil, India and China, and look at this landscape vis-a-vis the US, they blew past the US around 2000 in terms of their total spend, and interestingly, in their public ag R&D spending, and likewise in their total ag R&D spending. So we just released some new estimates last year that we did took about 3 or 4 years to put together because they're tough numbers to dig out. Our estimates are that China is now outspending the US both in public and private food ag R&D. The private includes state-owned companies, but also privately held shareholder companies and the like, and there's been major acquisitions of companies in the US that have gone into China. And so again, that landscape is shifting big time, and that the R&D hand is slow magic. It takes decades for that R&D investment to play its hand out in terms of productivity change. It still takes 7 to 10 years to develop a new crop variety, and then it takes a decade or two for that to work its way into farmers' fields and so forth. So the consequences of this are sort of long-term structural consequences, but there's clear evidence that the future ahead for the US, if it continues on the policy trajectory it's been doing for the last 3 decades, it's going to be a diminished comparative advantage with respect to productivity growth vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And clearly, most people don't recognise that China's agricultural economy is more than double the size of the US, and so one might expect China to be spending more than the US on food and ag R&D. And so what we do to often normalise those spending relativities is to look at the amount of R&D spend relative to the economic size of the economy, and we call that an intensity ratio. And here you can see a significant run-up over the very long run in US intensity ratios up until that downturn where there's been a precipitous drop in the public intensity. So that's saying for every $100 of output, say around 2000, we were investing about $4 in public food and ag R&D, and we're down to basically $2 of public investment relative to every $100. And that gives you an indication about the sort of intensity and depth of investment in innovation that's supporting that economic activity with respect to handling increasingly complex problems around climate change and other environmental concerns, some quite legitimate environmental concerns that impact agriculture or agriculture impacts those climate activities, but also at root sort of production costs and prices of food and costs of production also get short-shrifted when you start diminishing your intensity of investment in those sectors. And you can see China has started to increase its intensity of investment. Looking in the looking glass looking forward, my sense is that China is going to keep intensifying its investment. We've looked at a lot of historical data, and so they're going to keep scaling up their total investments because they're going to intensify their investments in agriculture. The reason their intensities are so low is because their output and productivity growth rates have been huge relative to the US over the last several decades. So whilst they've been doubling down in investments, their ag economies have been growing at a fast pace, and so their intensity, they haven't intensified their investment. I expect as they start to slow their overall growth, to sustain those productivity performances of the past into the future, they're going to start intensifying. So that's only going to magnify these differences between China and the US, and the US and the Brazil, Indias and Chinas of the world, unless there's a clear policy shift in that direction. So quickly to wrap up, if you look at Joe's and Vince's excellent report that was released today, so what do the candidates say about this? There's only one candidate, Buttigieg, who actually puts a number down and puts $5 billion down as a target to grow investments in public investments in food and ag R&D. And that would not redress the rundown that we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years. It would scale that back a bit, but it wouldn't turn that around or get us back on a growth trajectory to recover the lost ground that we've had over the last several decades. Vice President Biden has given some direct commentary with respect to increasing investments around competitive funding programs in the public sector, but doesn't put any numbers out there. A couple of other candidates allude to comparatively small increases. So Klobuchar talks about tens of millions going in when we need to redress the rundown, we need billions. And President Trump talks about 100 million or so of topping up in competitive funding programs and the like. And most of the other candidates are either opaque or silent with respect to investments. Bloomberg does make some mention about investing in climate-related research with some apparent implications into agriculture, but how much of that's going to be focused on at root on productivity concerns with agriculture is an open question. So I think from a founding of the USDA where R&D was ground zero for the modus operandi of that department, to now where it's seemingly rounding error in the overall budget and on the periphery of most candidates' budgets is, I think, an encapsulation of the shift in the R&D focus politically in the US.
Well, we've had three economists speaking. Now we're going to hear from someone who has a much better feel for the politics on the ground and where the candidates are standing and where the agricultural sector and the rural sector are viewing those candidates. And Jerry, it's my pleasure to introduce you to speak on those issues.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking you and Joe for writing this report, which saves the rest of us so much work. All that comparative material. I will also begin by noting that I grew up on a farm in North Dakota, but I was one of those farm kids who thought life on the farm was boring, and I fled to go to the big city, where I was lucky enough to become a political reporter. And I covered the political consulting industry at National Journal until I was lured back into agriculture They needed someone to cover the farm bill, and they said, at least you grew up on a farm. So I am, in a way, returning to my journalistic roots by talking about the politics of rural America. And of course, the important thing is that agriculture and rural issues are really only important during the Iowa caucuses. It's the only time that they get a focus. And before I talk about this year's situation, I'd like to do a little bit of history here, going back to 2008. And 2008 was an extraordinary year in rural politics because Barack Obama took such an interest in agricultural and rural issues. And he put out papers, but the most important thing was that he really asked for the rural vote in Iowa and in other places. I remember early in that year getting a call from the Obama campaign, and I was so shocked because I never heard anything from any Democratic presidential campaigns. I mean, trying to promote a story about the candidates' positions on agriculture. I mean, this is just unheard of. And he did indeed have detailed policy positions. And like most Democratic candidates, he emphasized competition policy, dislike for big business, and also stricter enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is supposed to protect producers from big business, basically in the meat industry. But you might ask why. Well, first I would say Obama was a state senator from Illinois, and even though he represented Chicago, he also had spent time in Springfield, and secondly, he was a U.S. senator from Illinois. So you did have there a background, a forced background in agriculture, perhaps, but he had another big advantage. Senator John McCain never voted for a farm bill, and he detested ethanol. So there was an opportunity there, and Obama took it, and he ended up in the general election, according to the exit polls, winning 50% of the farm vote, which is, or I won't say farm vote, of the rural vote, which is extraordinary for a Democratic candidate, has been. The only one that we can go back to who did fairly well in rural America was Bill Clinton in recent times. So then to go to, but by 2012, the bloom was off the Obama rose. First of all, there hadn't been much enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act, but that's a relatively minor issue. Affects only the smallest farmers. The big farmers don't care about it, or they don't want much enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act. But secondly, the Democrats in Congress had proposed the carbon tax, which the American Farm Bureau Federation opposed vigorously, and the Environmental Protection Agency had proposed this Waters of the United States rule, which the farmers detested because they were afraid it was going to bring WOTUS or bring EPA onto their farms. It wouldn't have actually been EPA, it would have probably been the state EPAs, but in any case, they didn't want these agencies coming onto their farms. That year also, Mitt Romney did not have a reputation, he hadn't been in Congress, but he did not have a reputation of opposing agricultural policies, and he did campaign for the rural vote. But Obama, according to the exit polls, Obama still got 40% of the rural vote in 2012. So then we go now to 2016. In 2016, ethanol was the big issue. In Iowa, there was this huge forum at which the Republican candidates staked out their positions on ethanol. And there were some variations on the theme, but they were generally supportive except for Senator Ted Cruz. And he was a vigorous opponent of ethanol, but he won the Iowa caucuses. Now, of course, winning the Iowa caucuses means that you win by a little bit. But that doesn't mean that it isn't like you've won an overwhelming majority. You've just gotten more votes than any other candidate. Now, Donald Trump said he was supportive of ethanol. I believe he came in second in those caucuses. And then, of course, Cruz faded and Trump became became the candidate. Now, in 2016, Hillary Clinton put out a detailed paper on agricultural policy and then didn't campaign in rural America. I remember she did one big event that was very highly orchestrated in Des Moines, and that was sort of the end of it. And of course, Trump had an appeal, I think, in rural America, most of all with his criticisms of the coastal elites. He fed into a lot of resentment in rural America about what's going on in the country, how the country is changing, and especially in rural America where the population is going down, a lot of the more liberal youth leave, and so it seems to become a more conservative place all the time. And so Trump won big time in rural America in the election. Now, I'm going to do one sentence here on 2018 because I think it's important to note that in the Democratic victories in the House races in 2018, they won a number of districts that are a mix of suburban and rural. And so you have had a shift there. Usually the Republicans, perhaps always the Republicans, did prevail in the rural counties, but the way the districts are constructed, there are a number of Democrats who partially represent rural America, more than there were before the 2018 elections. So now we're up to 2020. I have to say that agriculture and rural issues have been less important in this election than in any election I've covered in many years. As far as I can tell, there's only one big Democratic event, and that was last summer in Storm Lake, Iowa, when they invited all the candidates to appear. And the reporters who did cover that event, it was kind of hard to get to. It was a 4-hour drive from either Des Moines or Omaha, as I recall. But the reporters who were there complained about the event because I think it was described as a debate, but it wasn't anything like that. Each candidate would go to the stage, make a presentation, and go out in the hallway and hold a press conference while the next candidate was appearing. So if you were a reporter there, you couldn't possibly cover two things at the same time. But there has been no big event on ethanol, even though there's a lot of controversy over the candidates' positions. And another important thing that has happened, I think, is that the candidates all have papers, and most of them are, like usual, they're criticizing big ag mergers, and they're emphasizing the Packers and Stockyards Act, but a group called Take Back Our Courts, which wants to enlarge the Supreme Court, says that unless the Supreme Court is changed, and none of those policies would work. So in fact, I'd have to say this Take Back Our Court seems to be a Democratic with a big D inspired group, but they're criticizing their own candidates and saying, you can talk about these things, but this isn't going to happen. So we're kind of in that position. Now, where are we at with Trump? Well, Trump rewrote the Waters of the United States rule. The farmers are thrilled. I mean, the number of press releases I got from farm groups praising the rewrite, to say it's extraordinary, it's universal. There's almost no criticism of it. It's possible to say that Trump's performance in rural America has been mixed. I think rural people have liked a lot of what he has said on a cultural basis. But of course, on trade, he's taken a position that is in conflict with the extraordinary exports that we've had from rural America in the last several decades. But then there's the trade aid bailout, which we have been talking about. So on trade, the farmers seem to have been satisfied, but of course they say they want trade, not aid. They want to export. They don't want to get subsidies. but they're sticking with the subsidies. And then, of course, in biofuels, they've just generally not been happy with this administration because of the small refinery waivers. And in fact, Senator Grassley has said that he believes that EPA needs to be issuing monthly statements on their progress towards meeting the 15 billion gallons of ethanol being used, because otherwise farmers aren't going to trust them. Now, obviously, everyone is giving Trump the advantage in rural America, and I would certainly have said that. But I'm now thinking that while this has not been an interesting period leading up to the Iowa caucuses, the time when we're thinking about agriculture, now I think that the rest of the year is unpredictable. And here are my reasons. We've passed Trump has signed the deal with Canada. Both houses of Congress have passed the USMCA deal. But now the question is going to be, will China start importing? Will we increase dairy exports to Canada the way that the advocates of the USMCA have been saying should happen? And to fit in with this, we have the question of whether there'll be another trade aid package in 2020. There's one coming out that's the last of the 2019. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue has said, we don't need another package because we're going to be exporting, but we don't know whether that will be. And at the American Farm Bureau Federation convention, the delegates came out in favor of consideration of another package. And that is sort of in conflict with previous Farm Bureau policy, which has always been very free trade oriented. And then, of course, the renewable fuel standard latest iteration was released, and the biofuels industry is not happy with it, and they are very distrustful of the administration's promise that they're going to move up to this $15 billion, or not $15 billion, 15 billion gallon level. So at this point, I think that the race in rural America could be more interesting than we expect it to be right now, depending on what happens in the rest of the year. In my view, the Democrats' best position they could have taken, they haven't taken, and that would have been to criticize Trump on trade. And the reason I think they haven't taken it is that both the Democrats and the Republicans care more about the votes of manufacturing workers than they do about the farm vote. And both sides really want the votes, especially in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And there are more manufacturing workers and retired manufacturing workers than there are farmers. So I think that's where we're at on why we don't have stronger positions on the trade issue. But what's happened as I was preparing for this event is that I have been forced to think about the 2023 Farm Bill. And I now believe we really have a lot of questions about what that's going to be like. The Washington Post recently did a story in which they said that we have ended the period of free trade with the signing of the China deal. We are now in a period of managed trade. There would be people who would say, we've always been in a period of managed trade, but now it's kind of clear. If we're in a period of managed trade, what does that mean for farm policy? How are we going to aid farmers? What are the expectations? Second thing is, will the Trump administration or President Trump follow up on his promise that he's going to cut spending in a next administration? If he's reelected, will he really insist on that? We don't know that. But finally, I will bring up the issue that I haven't mentioned here, which is the nutrition programs. And as many people in this room know, the Trump administration has been making it harder for people to have access to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps. They have made some changes to the school meals program that nutritionists don't like. And I believe that when we get into a farm bill, there is going to be pushback about this, especially if the Democrats are in charge of the House, which according to most analysts, they still will be. So I think we might have a more exciting election in rural America than we have been expecting. And I think that our debate over the next farm bill will be both vigorous and unpredictable. Stop there.
Let's thank the audience. Let's thank the speakers for their opening remarks.
I'm all for that.
And we should congratulate them for not taking the whole hour and a half and leaving us with about half an hour for Q&A. I want to ask them dozens of questions myself, but I'm going to be a well-behaved moderator. If you have a question, could you signal by the way you used to in elementary school, raising your hand? And could you ask a question and not make a speech so that we can draw on the expertise? There's a question right at the front here to start off with.
I'm interested in whether there's been good analysis about the level of market losses due to the trade policies versus the market payments. Is it in rough equilibrium? Is it directed to the same constituencies? And what are the political implications of that?
Let me ask Joe Glauber to comment on that because he put out an AEI paper that in part discussed that very issue.
Yeah, and I guess we put out the paper in November, but there have been a number of studies that have looked at what the trade losses would be or have been due to the increased tariffs, and then compared them. And what I did in that paper is then compare it to what was paid out to the farmers. And generally, not surprising, the way USDA calculated the losses is they pretty much said, okay, here's what normally would go to China. If it doesn't go to China, what happens to prices? So it didn't take into account, some of that gets exported to other countries, some of it gets crushed domestic. In the case of soybeans, gets crushed domestically, some of that product gets exported. Most of the studies that I reviewed suggested that payment rates were about twice that of what the actual damages were. Now, let me just say, and I'll be brief, but a lot of farmers would contend, yes, but we have long-term costs from this as well. It may take us a while to get markets back, and then the other big thing is that the spread of these payments isn't at all necessarily to those who need it or who really suffer the losses. This last round of payments, in fact, went out kind of broad-based across the board, essentially because the payments were announced in the middle of planting season. I mean, it's the worst time in the world to start telling people, we're going to pay you this amount for soybeans, because everybody will start planting soybeans at a time when you don't. And so to USDA's credit, I think they try to make it very generic, but it ended up meant that these payments went to a lot of different crops, not just the ones that were being adversely affected.
I'm going to throw in a little piece of information here. Nevertheless, as with most subsidies, certainly it's true of crop insurance subsidies, and it's true of these price-based and income-based subsidies, 70% of the money went to three crops. And the three crops were soybeans, corn, and wheat. And it's remarkable how consistent that message has been recently, but across time. So many of these subsidies are targeted to the Corn Belt and to the Northern Great Plains and down to the Southern Great Plains wheat belt. A question here.
Will Martin from IFPRI. Two questions, if I may, Mr. Chair. The first
As long as they're quick.
The first one, presidents, the normal sort of view, as I understand it, is presidents look after the national interest and representatives and senators look after more specific sets of interests. And President Trump seems to sort of follow that. I mean, a lot of his actions have involved tariffs on intermediate inputs, which are not the sort of thing you do to pander to special interests. They're much more concentrated, the users, than the final consumers. So, it seems like it's driven by a kind of a view of national interest. It's just that economists would view it as a very Colbertian 18th, 17th century view of national interest. But is that correct? And if it is, does that mean that you should make some adjustment for the allowance for the views put by, say, current politicians who are perhaps representing their own special interests, say the senator from Minnesota or whatever? And then, Phil, R&D. What's really peculiar about that fall in intensity in R&D is that it happened in a period of very high prices. So what you might have thought that there'd be a concern about scarcity and a desire to expand output. And so that's just what's going on here.
So I'm tempted to say, Phil, I want you to answer both questions. He's from Minnesota, where Senator Klobuchar is from. So why don't you take that initially?
Yeah, bedevils me, Will, and the point is that this structural shift in the priorities for R&D has sort of spanned administration. So there's just, I guess, as Jerry alluded to, the sort of lumbering shift in the votes in terms of rural-urban votes and what that means with respect to priorities within the Farm Bill are just a long-run processes have happened to start playing their hand out at a time when prices were high, and so that didn't induce a response to come back and think about how we could invest in R&D to keep costs of production lower and so forth. So I think it's a classic market failure problem. Those benefits are very diffuse, even within the farm community, but also amongst consumers, and so hard to get a constituency around those benefits, even when there's sort of short-term economic forces that, as an economist, you'd think it'd induce a response. I mean, just the nature of the politics that gives rise to the lack of investments now, as opposed in R&D, as opposed to the focus on investments when the USDA was born and a big chunk of the population was engaged in agriculture. There was just a coincidence of interest. So.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Well, having covered the Farm Bill, I have to say that when it has come to the research budget, it often gets cut in favor of other things. And as we learned this past year, with the Trump administration's decision to move the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture to Kansas City, the research community does not have a strong political base. None of the farm groups, except for the Farmers Union and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, opposed that move. They just remained silent. So the researchers do not have the strong relationship with the agricultural producers that they should have.
There's a question right over in my stage right at the back.
Hi, Josh Protas from Mazona Jewish Response to Hunger. Jerry, thank you for bringing up the nutrition program issues. And just a note on that, the attacks on the SNAP program that have come from this administration hurt rural communities among those who are impacted. I've read recently about the disproportionate spending for the trade assistance that goes to large farms, and also the small amount that goes to minority farmers. So I'm wondering if the panelists could speak about any of the candidates who have put forward any plans or proposals about socially disadvantaged farmers, and then also thinking about the recent press about the number of farmer suicides, and if that's something that any of the candidates have addressed. And then just one comment. This is the second program I've attended this week at AEI where the panel has been exclusively white men, and just would encourage AEI to think about a little more diversity in the panelists.
Well, let me respond to the last question. One of the challenges with agricultural policy, just to be very blunt, is how few women are writing on agricultural policy writ large. There's a lot of wonderful work done on the SNAP program by incredibly gifted women, some of whom are likely to win a Nobel Prize. But on standard agricultural policy issues, it is challenging to identify people, and I agree with you. Not only are we white, we're old. A quick comment on SNAP. Joe and I did not cover SNAP in the report because we specifically wanted to focus on agriculture qua agriculture. And SNAP is unequivocally a general income safety net support program across all low-income families, rather than concentrate on the family. I'm going to just throw...
Could I say one thing on that?
Please.
But it is reauthorized within the Farm Bill, and if we are talking possibly being in a period in which the administration is going to be pushing to cut spending, there will be trade-offs between nutrition and other programs in that debate.
Barry, do you want to talk about the small amounts going to?
Yeah, I mean it's it's the same with any program that's based upon acreage or production. It's concentrated among the big producers by definition. That's not new. It's not it's not specific to any one program. Even when you're talking about programs that are targeted at base acreage, which is not tied to production, you still have larger farms that have the larger base. One thing that I didn't mention that I think does come up, and it's come up from the administration with regard to crop insurance, is payment caps and means testing. And I'm not sure that the political realities are that the support is going where the financial support is going to where the political support is. But I do think certainly it's something that's been entertained, and it comes up across several of the candidates. I don't know that Congress has ever been real serious about enforcing or whether they could come up with limits on payments or means testing. And I think right now the means test is 900,000 or something.
Yes.
It's it's up there. This is also shaped a lot of the debate on crop insurance, whether there should be caps on the amount of subsidies that go there. One thing I will say, I looked at some of the University of Illinois budgets, and you really have to take those numbers. They don't really indicate any specific farm, but yeah, in terms of farm earnings, they are down much relative to what we've seen in the past. So to the extent that some farms are becoming more leveraged and under financial pressure, yes, it's real.
Dr. Glauber.
Yeah, just let me make one point on that, and I think it's unfortunate in one sense. I think of if I look back at this report, I wish we had done something on SNAP, because I think it is a real key debate in the farm bill, and Jerry can certainly talk about I guess the 2014 Farm Bill, where we had this whole long debate on whether or not to bring the means test down from $1 million to 900,000, and you would have thought the world was going to hell in a handbasket. But at the same time, the whole talk was on, the other big issue was wringing $5 billion out of the SNAP program. Why? Because of automatic eligibility, because you were in some other
work requirements
program. So if you were in some local welfare program, you could come in and automatically qualify for SNAP. Well, that was originally done in the Welfare and Reform Act of '96 to save paperwork, right? So it was seen as a savings, but by and large, CBO and others had done studies saying, well, there's some people falling through the cracks. You could actually save $5 billion if you put in more stringent requirements to make you come in and actually prove your income. But what are we talking about? Moving from 26,000 to 26,500? I mean, you're not talking about someone who's making 100,000 rather than 26,000. These are poor people. Yet that debate was, going along the same side. You were trying to think, can you really bring it down to $900,000 for debate? I mean, I think the whole farm programs, other things, I mean, is this whole debate on how much are they really a safety net? When Barry talks about off-farm income, other things, that if you were to set this on a means test basis, you'd get very different type of program, I think. And not necessarily one based on size, because as Barry rightly says, bigger farms are going to have bigger payments, and they very well may be running, have very small or poor incomes. But the fallacy of it all is once you start talking about income, then, why farmers? Why not small business?
Let me
Why
just
other people?
add that the SNAP benefits are much smaller than I think people typically realize. I mean, we're talking about very low poverty levels to qualify, and then the amount of the benefit is quite low. And another aspect of the whole thing, I think it was there was a bit of a cynical flavor to some of the debate in the last Farm Bill about the same individuals that we're talking about expanding eligibility for payments into cousins and uncles and everything else were arguing for these stronger work requirements and forcing individuals off of the SNAP rolls to some extent. But at the end of the day, there's a fundamental question. What do we want to do with these programs? The ag support programs, not SNAP, but what is... If the objective is to support agriculture, then why would we want to penalize large, more efficient farms? I don't know the answer, but I think there's a fundamental question there as to really what we're trying to do, other than curry political favor.
We have a question here, and then a question there. I promise I'll get you.
This is sort of a generic question for anyone. I've been roughly following agriculture policy since 1979 when the tractors surrounded the mall. You all remember that? I don't know how many other people do. At that time, the demand was for greater parity, and I knew nothing about parity, so I tried to look at it closely and came to the conclusion that parity was socialism for farmers. And now you're here to talk about the candidate's position. We have one socialist running for president, and yet, has anyone ever mentioned the fact that a lot of these support programs are essentially socialism for farmers? I know one of you brought up why farmers, why not manufacturers. That's sort of part of the same question. Do we even discuss the fact that we have a 100-year history of providing socialism for farmers while we don't provide it for welfare recipients and other groups?
Well, I'll just, Jerry? The most basic argument about why we have agricultural supports is that farmers essentially manufacture outdoors, and there are a lot of things that they cannot control. Most of all, the weather. Secondly, global markets, and so it starts from there. And I think anytime you talk about dismantling all these programs, you would get back to that issue. And now, and of course, they also represent huge. It's not so much the people; it's the huge swaths of the country. And if a big farmer goes under, you have economic repercussions throughout the entire community.
Well, to that same point, I mean, I think, you go back to this notion of a agricultural ideal and again, what you're trying to do. But if you listen, I think a stated objective of most policies, as Jerry said, is supporting the ag sector, but there's a notion that this is critical, food and fibers critical to the national defense or whatever you want to, however you want to consider it. It's important to the stability of society and everything. I teach a class in this, and I always ask the students, how important is coffee to the functioning of the U.S. economy, and where does it come from? So it's not clear to me that if we didn't grow it here, that we wouldn't have it, basically.
But I think you could also make an argument with Trump and the tariffs. and the new trade agreements, that we are moving in that direction on manufacturing. That is becoming, I don't know if you'd say socialistic, but it is less of a free economy and moving more towards government intervention.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to respond to this one question. And that is, we're in an absurd world. We're in a world where policies might have been more relevant in 1930 than they are today, where even among the largest farms, 50% of the household income comes from off the farm. And the farm fits into managing the long-run asset accumulation of very or relatively wealthy people. But we still have this model of people digging ditches and hardscrabble. And I think ERS about 4 years ago put out a statistic that only 2% of farmers, households that owned and managed farms were below the federal poverty line. That's a stunning number given that 13.5% of the population is below that line, and it tells you a lot about the nature of the people managing farms who are gifted, intelligent managers who know how to manage risk. They know how to manage the problems that Jerry was talking about, almost all of them. Not everyone. The issue that was raised earlier about what are we doing for socially disadvantaged farmers, the answer is very, very little. And they are a very small part of the total farm family, as it turns out. They're on reservations, they're in the Mississippi Delta, in mainly African-American communities, or they're in West Virginia, sort of Loretta Lynn world. So I need to be quiet and then go to the next question. I promised that the gentleman at the back would get a chance to ask his question.
So thank you very much. My question is very simple. What all the guys are thinking about the young farmers, how they supporting them, and what relationship with FFA or 4-H or the young farmers organization, what they think about it, because I haven't heard about it. And one more last comments. I grew up in the communist, the socialist country, in a farm. Don't try, believe me. It's not working.
Well, Jerry, would you like to respond a little bit to that question?
I didn't quite hear it. You're asking what do FFA and 4-H think about these policies?
Maybe
Young
Farm
farmer.
Bureau and MNFU too.
National
think.
Farmers
New
Union.
farmers and
I'm sorry, but what do they think about the candidates' policies or what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't seen these groups take any positions on any of these policies that have been announced.
The question here? The gentleman here? Right
Could
there.
I just add briefly something to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the one thing I would say is that, I mean, if you look at Warren and look at Sanders, their policies look like what the National Farmers Union has advocated for many years. That is, grain reserves, policies tied towards smaller farms. And so in that sense, I mean, you're right, there hasn't been any formal endorsements by these, and nor would you expect that at this early stage. But I think that it is striking to me, and as Jerry mentioned, things like Waters of the U.S. rule, that goes across both of the two big farm organizations. I think there's pretty universal concern about the Obama-era regulations on that. Sorry.
Yeah, just a question on tariffs. And I know there's no answer to this question, but this administration clearly is trying to bring people to the table, other countries to the table when they issue tariffs. But you know, what do you think is the direction of tariffs under this administration? What do you think is the long-term plan? I mean, today, if you step back and take a look at it, I mean, I was encouraged by the U.S.-China deal where the administration said, look, the next phase, all the 301 tariffs are on the table, okay? And then this last week, we got a notice from Commerce. They expanded the steel 232 tariffs slightly, but they're into steel products now. And now we've got a UK Prime Minister threatening tariffs if they don't get what they want in a trade deal. And this stuff, you know, it kind of goes on and on. But do you have any insights, any thoughts in terms of the behavior of this administration, of what their long-term plan is, and whether we're moving toward limiting tariffs or expanding? I mean, it's...
I don't know, Kendall. I look at this and think it's been nothing but expanding tariffs and using tariff as a threat for foreign policy. I mean, look, you know, no sooner had we inked a deal on USMCA than with Mexico that the president then threatened the Mexicans with additional tariffs because of the way they were or weren't enforcing the border patrols on immigration. And this whole sort of mercurial aspect where you pick up the paper or look at your Twitter feed and see that, oh, now we're on to new tariffs. And I guess it gets back to Will's question that we didn't really address, and that is this 19th century mercantilist view that, yeah, we got to protect industry. I mean, the irony to me from all this trade stuff is, gee, you know, as economists, we were right. You know, you raise tariffs, trade falls. You try to hit one aspect of the economy with high tariffs, guess what? There's unintended consequences. So you have the next level of manufacturers who are using those inputs. All of a sudden, they have to raise their costs. And so what happens? You get this tariff creep. Oh, got to protect the nail manufacturers now. Got to do, and you know, where does that end up? You know, with automotives? I mean, I hope not, because I think we're, you know, you would love to see, I mean, at one level, if you think, okay, this is a bargaining ploy, just make everyone so worried and angry that they get to the table, and then we can get some serious liberalization done. And that was sort of the Reagan era things that I always thought, at least, because at one level they were the Reagan era, the Reagan people were saying we want free trade, but at the same time we're going to hit a 301 here or whatever. Here I have no idea what the purpose of all this is, other than it just seems that it continues to happen. I mean, we hope that it's going to be a quiet period between here and the election, but I suspect it won't be.
So we have, the lady far end has been incredibly patient, and this will be the last question with apologies to everybody else, because we're hitting our witching hour.
Thank you. I just wondered, did the candidates have strong differences in dairy policy?
Like Klobuchar is very, very much a supporter of the dairy margin program, right? And I haven't heard a lot else from the others.
Yeah, I think it's mainly with Sanders, Warren, and Klobuchar. They're probably the most involved with, and maybe it's because of Senate experience and other things that they've had to deal with these issues. Klobuchar, obviously, and Sanders too, both coming from states with big dairy industries. They've talked about price supports tying to those to cost of production. I mean, obviously, dairy doesn't have a price support. I don't think they've been as specific on that aspect about things. But yeah, I don't know, Vince, you looked at that as well.
I looked at that issue. Specifically on dairy, it seems as though all of the candidates on the Democratic side and the president are saying, we have a program in place, it looks like it's sort of working okay, and they really haven't gotten into the issue. The big question on dairy is more on the bankruptcy of the processors. The bankruptcies of a couple of major processors and the issue around concentration. And certainly Warren and Sanders have views on competition policy that we talk about in the paper that would apply there. I'm going to close with two comments. One, so now I understand that the Trump administration is a random tariff generating operation, and we never know where they're going to go next. The other, which has not been remarked on, is that remarkably, most of these candidates are happy to spend tax dollars or increase the budget deficit in order to buy votes in rural areas. And that's not uncommon, and it carries on a long and valued tradition in presidential politics. Promise now and think about paying later, if at all, apparently. Finally, I want to thank you, the audience, and the questions that you have raised, which have been remarkably prescient. And I'd like to thank in particular the panel for their insight and wisdom. And thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.